any other social media giant.
My Lords, I rise to speak to my Amendment 43, tackling Clause 12.1, which expressly says that duties in Clause 12 are to empower users. And my concern is to ensure that, firstly, users are empowered, and that also legitimate criticism around, for example, the characteristics listed in sections 12.1 and 12.2 are not automatically treated as abusive or inciting hatred, as I fear they could be. And my Amendment 283ZA specifies that in judging content, this is to be filtered out after a user has chosen to switch on various filters, that the providers act reasonably, that they pause and consider if they have reasonable grounds to believe the content of the kind in question, i.e. abusive or problematic. Now, anything under the title Empower Adult Users sounds appealing. I mean, how can I oppose that? I am, after all, a fan of the taking back control form of politics, and here's a way, surely, for users to be in control. And on paper, replacing the legal but harmful clause with giving adults the opportunity to engage with controversial content if they wish through enhanced empowerment tools sounds very positive. And actually, if I could quote the noble Baroness Featherstone from an earlier discussion of the bill, she said, let's treat adults as adults, allowing them to confront ideas with, quote, the better ethics, reasoning and evidence that has been the most effective way to deal with ideas from Socrates onwards. Hear to that. However, I worry that rather than users being in control, there is a danger that the filter system might infantilise adult users and actually disempower them by hardwiring it into the bill a duty and a tendency to hide content from users. I think there's a general weakness in this bill that I've noted. I've already noted that some platforms are actually based on users moderating their own sites, which I'm quite keen on, but this will be detrimentally affected by the bill, leaving those users in charge of their own moderation with no powers to decide, for example, what's in Wikipedia or other Wikimedia projects, as an example, that are added to, organised and edited by a decentralised community of users. So I'm certainly not going to take the phrase users empowerment at face value. And I'm slightly concerned about linguistic doublespeak, or at least confusion. The whole bill is being brought forward in a climate in which language is weaponised in a toxic minefield, a climate of you can't say that. And more nerve-wrackingly, words and ideas are seen as dangerous and interchangeable with violent acts in a way that I think really needs to be unpicked before we pass this legislation. Speakers can be cancelled for words deemed to threaten safety of listeners, but not physical safety, but opinions that are said to be unsafe. Opinions are treated as though they cause damage or harm as viscerally as physical aggression. So lawmakers have to recognise that the cultural context and realise that the law is going to be understood and applied in that context, not in the abstract. And I'm afraid the language in 12.1 and 12.2 show no awareness of this wider backdrop, and I think it's worryingly woolly and vague. And we've already heard Baroness Morgan talk about dangerous content, and all the time we have to ask, who is going to interpret what is dangerous? What do we mean by dangerous or harmful? So we take a term like abusive that's used in the legislation, surely that's open to wide interpretation. Dictionary definitions of abusive include words like rude, insulting, offensive, and certainly it's subjective. And so when some commentators who complain they've been victims of online abuse, and then actually if you check their timeline, you notice that actually really they've just been subject to angry and sometimes justified criticism, we have to query what we mean by the terms. I recently saw a whole thread arguing that the Labour Party's recent attack ads against the Prime Minister were an example of abusive hate speech. I'm not making a point about it. I'm asking who gets to decide. And if this is the threshold for filtering content, then I think there's a danger of institutionalising safe space echo chambers. I think it can also be a confusing word for users too, because if someone applies a user empowerment tool to protect themselves from abuse, the threshold at which the filter operates could be much lower than they intend or envisage. But by definition, the user would not know what had been filtered out in their name. And they have no control over the filtering because they never see the filtered content. And the same is true of the bill's use of the term incites hatred. The word hatred in 2023 is actually highly contentious in the public arena. Indeed, over the last decade, Parliament has really wrestled with criminal offences in terms of incitement to hatred, and safeguards were built into legislation in the past, including free speech clauses in controversial areas such as religion. However, in this bill, the term hatred is just, it seems to me, free-floating. So a user who understands inciting hatred to cover really malicious, nasty content might not realise how much other content could be filtered out by the filtering tool if it operates at a low threshold of understanding what inciting hatred is. It's also the case that inciting hatred around protected characteristics is fraught as an issue offline, let alone online. Huge rows about whether accusations of Islamophobia and inciting hatred of Muslims is used to avoid sometimes open debate on extreme Islamist views. Or will, for example, images such as the cartoons in the Charlie Hebdo magazine be seen as inciting hatred by some? Will they get filtered out? Similarly, some say accusations of anti-Semitism, inciting hatred of Jewish people, is used to quell legitimate criticism of Israeli policy. And I could go on. And I'm not making a comment on any of those issues, other than to note that those who think that hatred as a basis for filtering online content is easy need to get out a bit more. And that's before we even get on to the gender wars. Regularly, those who assert the immutability of biological sex are accused of whipping up hatred against trans people. Joanna Cherry MP has just had a talk cancelled by the Stand Comedy Club for just that. And even though the label transphobic hate speech directed at Joanna Cherry MP is totally illegitimate, in my opinion, because she's a crusader for women's rights and lesbian rights, it doesn't matter whether you or I agree or we should have an argument or whatever you, that's what debate is. But we have to ask, who will filter out or decide from a big tech company what is hatred or not? So these are the kind of issues that I think we have to take note are difficult. So it's worth noting, and I suppose I wish to ask the Minister, who does the government envisage will do the filtering? Do online filterers, let alone algorithms or machine learning, have the qualifications to establish what constitutes abuse or hatred? In other professions, from the College of Policing to overzealous HR departments and senior management teams in universities, we've seen over-caution in censoring and banning material under the auspices of hatred, of abuse, and obviously over that weasel word, harm again. So won't the bill, rather than empowering users, empower a new staff team of filterers trained in their own company's equality, diversity and inclusion norms to use filtering tools at the lowest common denominator and leading to over-removal policies that err on the side of caution in order to comply with regulations? So all that Amendment 43 does is to borrow the language of discussion or criticism from the free speech clause in the Stirring Up Hatred Offences section of the 1986 Public Order Bill to try and lift the threshold at which 12.1 and 12.11, see because I'm so confused, might kick in. It's not ideal, but there's a lot at stake. And just to finish, I just want to completely oppose those amendments which promote a default setting. That is clearly advocating a censorious approach to legal speech. I rather liked an analogy that I heard the IEA's Matthew Lesh use recently when he said, imagine if when you go to a bookshop and you had to ask the shop assistant to let you into the special room that contains harmful books. Of course, material is still accessible, but creating a barrier to accessing certain speech that is perhaps uncomfortable in terms of religion or race or gender also forces people to identify themselves. If you say, can I please switch into the harmful speech section or go into the harmful section of the bookshop, immediately you label yourself as pro-dangerous, pro-harmful material. And to be honest, if those advocating these provisions are so certain about the righteousness of knowing this speech is problematic, then I think it would be more honest to just simply outlaw it. And what's more, the director of Defend Digital Me, Jen Person, has raised concern that by considering all adults to be at risk of harm in this way, that the bill can infantilise us because it assumes that adults are inherently vulnerable. It's a sort of paternalistic big brother that I think we want to avoid in the bill. My Lords, finally, it is damaging in a democracy to have a proliferation of things that are unsayable. And as this bill reflects, so much debate takes place online. So it seems to me that it's our responsibility as legislators to encourage a diversity of views to circulate, rather than carelessly or inadvertently narrowing the range of what circulates previously. In previous groups, we've mentioned Germany's now infamous legislation which was brought in 2017, which now actually is facing major opposition at home, because the Danish free speech think tank Justista notes the German government's adoption of NetzDG was a good faith initiative to curb hate online, but has provided a blueprint for internet censorship that's been used to target dissent and pluralism. And I fear that unless we're very careful with this section, we will do the same.
Lords, it's a pleasure to follow Baroness Fox. I'm afraid on this issue, as I'm sure she will expect, we